more than 30 states now, 31 states have opted in to or said they will be opting into the federal scholarship tax credit program, which enables eligible taxpayers to claim a federal tax credit of up to $1,700 for qualified contributions that then they can direct to scholarship organizations of their choice. And these scholarships can go to public schools, private schools, they can be for any number of things. You can specifically love a certain scholarship organization that operates in Washington that helps kids with special education programs. Maybe you have a special tutoring organization. Maybe you want to help out a transportation scholarship organization. You can direct that. You get to take the $1,700 off your federal income tax. It's a tax credit, and one for one, those dollars then can get directed. The bugaboo here is that unless Washington opts into this program and Governor Bob Ferguson opts us into this program, we will be directing our $1,700 tax credit to another state that has opted in. So here is Washington Policy Center's Education Center Director, Vicki Murray, with a little bit more on that.
So about 90% of all students in Washington state would be eligible for a K-12 educational scholarship. We already have we can already take that credit. So let's say, I write a $1,700 check to an SGO. That SGO pools donations and awards scholarships to cover expenses at any public school, any public charter school, any private school, both secular and religious, and homeschoolers if they're considered a school under state law. So we can already take that credit. And conservative estimates suggest that each year, if just 30% of Washington federal taxpayers write that $1,700 check, and you can write any amount up to $1,700, we would generate over $700 million annually for our public and private school students here in Washington state. Carlene, here's the only question still on the table, is whether or not we can donate to scholarship granting organizations in Washington, or whether that $700 million is going to flow to SGOs in other states. Here's why. Governor Ferguson must opt our state into the program. So he has until January 1st of 2027 to opt us in. If he does not opt us in, we can also claim that tax credit, but it's going to benefit the now 31 states that have formally and informally said they are going to opt in, which means we can send our money to Idaho, Montana, Mississippi, or even New York, because New York was the most recent state to formally opt in. And you want to know why? The governor there said, I can't in good conscience let, in their case, over $1 billion leave the state every year. When, think about it, most children attend public schools. Public schools through their students would be the massive beneficiaries of this program.
Now, up to now, Washington's Superintendent of Public Instruction, Chris Reykdal, has stated he is opposed to having Washington join this program. He suggests it's going to just pull more money from public education and put it into private education, which is not true. There's not anything about this program that would pull any current money or funding, whether it comes from the federal government or the state government, into education. There is nothing that suggests that is going to happen. This is additional money. This is you, Joe taxpayer, saying, I want a $1,700 credit from my federal education dollars to go to a scholarship of my choosing. But again, we have to opt in Washington state. Now, I did ask Superintendent Reykdal about this specifically during a press conference back on February 5th. This was his response to my question directly to him. Why not opt us into this and put more money into Washington education programs?
I'm not vehemently opposed. I want it to go back to Congress because it's so ill-conceived. It doesn't have rules around it, doesn't have shape around it. You have unelected officials who are going to control potentially hundreds of millions of tax dollars. You're going to send public tax money to private institutions potentially. We don't have guidance yet from the U.S. Treasury Department. They put out sort of political statements, but no real guidance. So what I have said is families with kids in schools consistent with this affordability approach absolutely need a tax credit for having kids for school, public and private. That can be done through the tax code, not by the state picking and choosing kids who are going to get scholarships to fund religious education. I don't think that's appropriate, but there's a way to get every family, public or private, some more help. And I think if it goes back to Congress and they actually turn this into a tax credit for families, that's the way to go. If they don't choose to do that and they say it's up to each state, I suspect at some point we will be in, and we should be in, if we can control what that looks like. Giving it over to people who are unelected and unaccountable to drive taxpayer money into religious institutions and for-profit schools is not consistent with our values.
Now, at the time, Superintendent Reykdal told me in my follow-up question to him that they had not received enough guidance from the U.S. Treasury Department as to how all this would work. But just last week, Treasury issued some new guidance, some further details. And Murray at Washington Policy Center told me that, you know, any state that has questions about this can certainly receive additional guidance from Treasury along the way. It's unclear if OSPI received that guidance from Treasury. I reached back out with a follow up today to ask them, were you part of this? Did you receive the guidance from Treasury? Do you have further questions that haven't been answered? And I did not receive a response. But again, the pressure is now increasing on Governor Ferguson and other holdout states to get on board.
All these governors have to make a simple decision. Every one of us as federal taxpayers can now take this credit. The only question for our governor, along with the governors of other holdout states, is do we want our federal dollars to go to the IRS or flow out of state to other students and other schools, or do we want to keep those funds in states? I don't see why this is such a tough decision. Again, this should be a no-brainer. It's conservatively $700 million annually for our students and our schools. Opt us in.
Now, Governor Ferguson did not respond to my emails yesterday or today asking if he has made a decision, if he has further questions about how the program will operate and what his, hesitation is at this point with getting on board. I also reached out to the Washington Education Association to find out what their opposition is really all about. Why would they be opposed to this? Because again, this isn't any redirection of public education dollars into the private education system or charter schools or anything else. You, the taxpayer, get to say, here's my $1,700 tax credit. Thank you very much. I get to take that off of my federal income taxes, which is a break, right? But I also then get to direct it wherever I want to. But if we don't opt in, we still can take the tax credit, but then we had to send it to some of the other states that have opted in: Idaho, Montana, Colorado, New York. Yes, we have some Democratic states that have opted into this, but Washington is not yet among those. And finally, in keeping with our Seattle theme here, Downtown Seattle Association CEO John Scholes is again speaking out about all of the businesses leaving the city of Seattle. We've got a lot of buildings. If you've been downtown recently, you've seen some that have been boarded up for months or longer. And all of this obviously impacts the bottom line tax revenue base for the city. And then there's property values that are impacted by that. The tax burden has to be shifted somewhere, right? So it gets shifted onto the remaining businesses and shifted onto Seattle residents, because of course you've got even big businesses leave, and so then a lot of the tax revenue associated leaves with them. but you still have to pay police and you still have to pay for all the other public services that a big city like Seattle has to fund. So here is part of my colleague Randy Diamond's conversation today with the CEO of the Downtown Seattle Association.
We've certainly continued to communicate with the administration our concerns about what job loss has meant for downtown, what it's meant for commercial office values, and how collapsing commercial property tax value shifts the property tax burden to residents in our city, as well as small businesses who are paying a portion of property tax through their leases, and are urging Seattle leaders to correct course here, both in not just the cost and the dollars and cents and what does it cost here to locate a job relative to other places, but also, the tone and tenor in which city leaders are speaking about jobs and employers and business generally. I think we've not been the most productive and helpful of cities when it comes to the posture toward business, and it's been too adversarial in some ways. And then the third area is just around predictability. We need to be more predictable as a place to do business. I think it seems every year or so there's a new tax or regulation or multiple new taxes and regulations that are being proposed or implemented. And we've created a very unpredictable business environment for folks who are looking to place capital or to locate a company or to grow jobs. When they're looking out 5 or 10 years, it's hard, I think, for them to expect a consistent operating environment. And that needs to change if we want to remain competitive.
I was looking through some of the candidate questionnaires that you and a few others had, I think, to different Democratic parties. And I saw that you had wrote that the courts have to start with the Constitution, and that if legislation crosses the line, it should be declared unconstitutional. Was wondering how that philosophy shapes your approach to, say, voter approved legislation, or legislation enacted by the legislature that pushes constitutional boundaries.
Well, certainly if that comes to the court, there will be arguments on both sides. And some will be saying the Constitution says this, and therefore this is allowed. And some will be saying the Constitution doesn't allow this, and here's the authority for that, and here's the precedent for that. And so I would consider arguments on both sides. Look at the Constitution and read it myself and understand that different people can read different meanings into the same words. Obviously, we have a court system for a reason, because if everybody read the same thing the same way every time, we would be out of a job. But where there is a dispute, where there is clear ambiguity, then you look at how it's been interpreted in the past, and then you look at whether there's been a mistake in the past. We have a history of sometimes interpreting things the wrong way, and that's why the Supreme Court has the mandate, if you will, to overturn past precedent. What's the process and what do you weigh? I have to say that's a case-by-case analysis. Sometimes it's going to be very obvious because the Constitution says this and the legislation says this. Sometimes the question will be that, well, the Constitution says this broadly. How does this specific term either fit into or not fit into? And I think the analysis is depending on the case and the argument. So if I'm approaching that decision, I will read, understand, research, not substitute my own judgment for that of the arguments in front of me, but be persuaded by the one that I think is the most in line with the Constitution as written or what is clearly intended. Reasonable minds will disagree on that, and I will give it my best judgment in the time.
And I know you can't say how you would rule on a future case or an issue likely to reach the court, but looking at some high-profile decisions in the past, like the Blake decision, in the Quinn decision in 2023, how should voters understand how you would consider cases where precedent, constitutional text, public safety, and tax policy, all this legislative intent collides?
That's 16 questions in one, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, where legislation collides with precedent, we have precedent that says precedent isn't overturned unless it's wrongly decided and currently harmful. And then there has to be a real live controversy, and there has to be someone withstanding. So just because there's a law that may in fact be constitutional on the books, it doesn't come before the Supreme Court until or unless there is a case and a litigant that challenges that. So it's not like any Supreme Court justice just gets to clean house and say, da, 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 da. The cases have to be brought by people who've been harmed by them or have standing, and then that comes to the court. What does the court do in evaluating precedent? I guess we have our own precedent about when that is appropriate or not. Not to not answer your question, but to say that the process, I think, is the same no matter what the issue is. And if it's, again, legislation based or whether it's a case that interpreted legislation, again, if it was wrongly decided and it's currently harmful, the Supreme Court has the duty to fix those decisions. And sometimes that happens decades later. Sometimes, probably more rarely, it can be a faster turnaround to adjust something that was wrong to begin with. But in any human system, human error is made, and the beauty of our system is that we have a mechanism for fixing that. But that mechanism shouldn't be like a whipsaw where you're just going back and forth every change in administration, every election. Now we have different precedent. Now we have different laws, different decisions. I think the predictability, consistency, and stability of the court system and judicial decisions is important so that litigants and attorneys know what to predict under similar circumstances and get the same kind of ruling under the same kinds of facts. Though no two cases are identical, you should have some reasonable expectation of the range of outcomes in order just to function as a society of laws.
And are there parts of the Supreme Court's reasoning in either the Blake or Quinn cases where you think voters should pay closer attention to when assessing candidates ahead of August?
That is an area I'm going to decline
Hmm.
to comment on because Quinn, of course, had to do with the capital gains tax. Now we have perhaps similar, perhaps not so similar income tax legislation coming on. So if I were even to point the public to this, it would
Hmm.
indicate, hey, I disagree with the majority. I agree with I can't put myself in that box because I need to maintain neutrality so I can hear all arguments without having predetermined which ones I like. I'm
Can
sorry.
you no, can you explain that judicial rule for voters? Because it might
Mm.
be a surprise to most people to read, like, hey, the income tax is front and center this year, but they can't even talk about it. Can you
Nobody
explain that
can.
rule and then also the limits that you guys have in soliciting donations? Because I know you guys can't personally solicit funding as well.
Yeah. So the Code of Judicial Ethics is what governs judges and candidates for judicial positions. And it restrains us from, let's start with the donations, soliciting personally any donations. I
Hmm.
can't ask people for money. And I think the idea is, well, we shouldn't be buying our justice, right? There shouldn't
Hmm.
be the appearance that because I contributed to this campaign, therefore this judicial officer owes me something or is likely to make a decision that favors me or my business or my group interests, whatever they are, because they asked me for money and I gave it to them. I looked them in the eye and I know exactly what our understanding was.
Hmm.
Okay, so that does tie our hands a little bit because in trying to do fundraising for a campaign, a third party has to make the pitch and has to make the ask. And obviously, the public disclosure requirements show who gives any amount unless it's under $100. So there's full disclosure about who's supporting which candidate. That's a restriction on us. The other restrictions that we cannot promise or comment on issues or possible cases that may come before us. And I think that's also important because if I said, gee, I don't want to pay any more income taxes in the state, I don't want to pay any more taxes in the state of Washington,
Hmm.
I don't want another tax, and I go into a case with have that comment out there in the public, then people are going to think when I make a decision that's in favor of that outcome, oh, well, she's pre-decided it and we knew it and that's why we voted for her. That actually creates a partisan judiciary. And if this is a nonpartisan race and we want the judiciary to remain nonpartisan so that it can be the checks and balances for the two partisan branches of government, the legislative and the executive, well, then we've lost the the point of these separation of powers and the checks and balances because then it's just one party controlling everything. So that's why it's important not to comment on things that could come
Hmm.
before the court. And to your point, any case that you bring up, in theory, could come before the court in a 2-year term or in a 6-year term,
Hmm.
because there could be a case that arises and works its way up. And if the Supreme Court has authority to overturn any prior decision, it pretty much means that anything that's commented on
Hmm.
could create, again, that appearance of conflict, or the appearance of prejudging an issue and therefore having a closed mind when the case actually comes before the court. Thanks for asking that. It is really hard to say, okay,
Hmm.
look, vote for me. I can't promise you anything. I can't ask you for money. I can't do anything but say, well, then why are we running? Well, you run on experience, you run on character, you run on the person you trust most to make the decisions in the moment, to do the work, and to do so without owing anybody any favors or even appearing to have a conflict of interest.
Do you
That's
think,
what I'm emphasizing in my
uh,
campaign anyway.
sorry to interrupt you there. Do you think the state Supreme Court, as it is right now, or the situation it's heading, do you think we already have a partisan judiciary, or is the way recent appointments have been made, do you think that raises potential concerns or flags around a partisan judiciary?
Where I think some partisanship comes into play is just by the nature of the constitutional authority given to a partisan elected governor to appoint justices for a term when a prior justice retires. What happens and has happened in this election is two of our justices have retired before the end of their term, which gives Governor Ferguson, it gave Governor Inslee, it gave Governor Gregoire, any governor has the opportunity to appoint their replacement. Well, then that replacement, you might say, has a little bit of a leg up in the next election, even if they have to run, because now they're the incumbent. And to the average citizen, the incumbent somehow already earned the job, is maybe doing an okay job, or they don't have a reason to complain because they don't feel the effects of those decisions. And often incumbents don't get opposed in elections. They're just on the ballot. And so that becomes a way where a partisan governor, not to use the term stack the court, but can stack the court, can essentially handpick those justices who then still have to run for election. And that's what's going on in my race. There is an incumbent who's been on the bench for 5 months, appointed by the governor. I want to give the voters of Washington a choice. We don't know what went into the governor's analysis about why he picked this person. So the voters should determine the best candidate to be their own elected justice in the Supreme Court. If you look at the current state of the court, 6 of the 9 Supreme Court justices started their terms by appointment, all from democratically, well, Democrat, partisan
Mhm.
Democrat, by Democratic governors as opposed to Republican governors. They were all democratically elected, but they were part of one party versus another. Does that mean that they are leaning in a partisan direction? I think the fact that five open seats in this election are getting so much attention and press is that at least some voters in Washington think so. I personally know that any judicial officer I've encountered on any level of any court is mostly there for the right reasons, doing their best and doing the right thing. But as you can see in a society, we have a broad spectrum of perception about what the right thing is, the right way to go about it, the policies that are implemented, and the like. And so that's the long answer to that partisan question. I don't think it's non-existent, but
Mhm.
I'm not going to slap an overarching label on any individual justice because I know that well-meaning people still can disagree on how decisions are made.
So the two recent appointees, one your opponent Justice Colleen Medley, and then Theo Angelis in position 5. Theo worked with Governor Ferguson at K&L Gates, and Melody had worked under Ferguson when he was the Attorney General. Some might argue that, look, they have valuable experience. That's something that you would want in a position like this. But at the same time, it's very close. Do you think that it's getting too close for comfort in terms of those appointments, or how should voters assess that situation?
In my opinion, if I were in the shoes of Justice Melody and I had worked closely with the now governor and the governor signed legislation that's now before me, I would not be comfortable trying to evaluate that case because of the appearance of a conflict of interest. I would recuse myself. I can't imagine my own former boss. I worked with Michael Buney at Michael Buney and Associates in the first 17 years of my practice. If he had a case that came before me in the Supreme Court, I would recuse myself in a heartbeat because there's just a relationship at the water cooler or informally or something that goes beyond even the work bounds. I question, if you will, it's a dangerous thing to say. I question a governor who would think these appointees are great picks if he has worked closely with them and knows that there is at least the appearance of a conflict of interest if, again, legislation that he signs come before them. Surely there are any number of qualified judges and attorneys in Washington state that he has not worked closely with, that he could have chosen that didn't have that close personal connection. So there's something there that I think is worth questioning as to loyalty. We are not a society where loyalty trumps all. It should be experience, impartiality, and what voice do you bring? What perspective do you bring to the Supreme Court, as opposed to what loyalties have you built up in your career?